System audio lectures. So today we're going to look at the brain, and then on the next one we're going to come back and look at the spinal cord. So we want to look at the brain, and again, this part of the unit is all the stuff that you want to be familiar with and be able to kind of label for your practical. And then again, I want to take these structures and I just want to know really just what the basic functions are going to be, okay? So the first thing you want to remember about the brain, and we heard a lot about this when we looked at the bone chapter 2, is that your brain is, again, going to be the most important part of the body, controls everything that's going on in your body. So we're going to protect it really well, and we do that in 4 ways, okay? So we use the skull, which we've looked at a bunch. We use the meninges, we use this cerebral spinal fluid, and then we're going to have this blood-brain barrier. And again, we want to just kind of have a general idea of how each one of these things is adding to those elements of protection. Okay, so these are your meninges, and again, these ones I want to just be able to kind of label, and I want to sort of know what the main difference is between the 3. But the meninges are going to consist of 3 connective tissue membranes. They're going to lie just external to the central nervous system organs. And again, a lot of people kind of make the mistake of thinking that the meninges only cover the brain, but they're going to actually cover the spinal cord too. Okay, so they cover and protect the central nervous system. They protect the blood vessels. They're going to contain cerebral spinal fluid. We'll come back to that in a minute. And they're also going to form these partitions in the skull for us. So from external to internal, these are the meninges. Okay, you have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. And we can come to this picture here, okay? And it's kind of easier. I always find it easier to kind of start off with the brain and then sort of work your way to the external kind of skin and the scalp and things like that. So this is your pia mater, and this is my arachnoid mater, and this is going to be your dura mater. Now, the important thing to look at in this picture, especially if you're going to label from the outside to the inside, is that the dura mater has 2 parts to it, okay? So a lot of times people kind of label these, and they put this as the dura, then they move on to the arachnoid, and then they miss a lot of the other ones that are closer to the brain. So just pay close attention to that and realize that these 2 both combine to kind of make that dura mater. And this picture is really good because, again, especially if I'm a visual learner, I can kind of see where all these blood vessels are, sort of what layer things are in and sort of where things are located. And then again, when that comes up on your practicals or on your lecture exams, you can kind of come back and kind of remember this picture and kind of think about, okay, where were these located versus where were all the other things kind of located. So here is the dura mater. And again, a lot of things as they get more external, they're going to be tougher, and this one is kind of no different. So dura mater means tough mother, 2 layered sheets of fibrous connective tissue. Again, I get the periosteal layer. It's kind of telling you in the name sort of what it's doing, but it's attaching to that inner surface of the skull, and then I get this meningeal layer, and that's going to form the external covering of the actual brain, okay? And again, this is the one where it's got 2 parts to it, so it always kind of tricks people on the labeling. So again, I just put that in there just to kind of remind you, if you're going to label, especially from the outside to the inside, just be aware that the 2 layers of the dura mater are kind of in there. Arachnoid mater is going to be the next one. Loose brain covering. This one gets 2 spaces, so we get a subdural space and we get this subarachnoid space. And again, you have this arachnoid in the middle, and the spaces are just, the space in between the other 2 coverings. Okay, so the subdural space is going to be that space that separates the arachnoid from that outer dura mater. And then the subarachnoid space is going to be underneath the arachnoid mater, and it's going to separate the arachnoid mater from that pia mater that's closer to the brain. Okay, and this is the one, the subarachnoid space, a really good multiple choice question, is that this is going to be the one that's filled with the cerebrospinal fluid, and it's also going to be the one that all these blood vessels are in. And again, we're going to keep those kind of a little more interior just to keep them a little bit safer. Pia mater is going to be the one closest to the brain. It means gentle mother, composed of delicate connective tissue, because again, it's right next to the brain. And this one again is going to be richly invested with tiny blood vessels. And again, that's mostly because your brain needs a lot of energy and it needs a lot of nutrients to kind of function properly. Okay, so here's our picture again. Find the brain. First layer off the brain, pia mater. Next layer, arachnoid mater, and then these 2 layers here are going to make up that dura mater. And then I get to, my bone of my skull, I get to the periosteum, I get to the scalp on the very top. Okay, so really good one, and you can guarantee that this one's going to end up on your practical. So meningitis is probably the only time anyone ever hears about the meninges. So when you hear the term meningitis, it means this inflammation of the meninges, and this is a really serious thing where you kind of think you're just have a cold or you just have a headache, and then all of a sudden it spreads really quickly and it starts to kind of shut down all your other systems in your body. But it's bacteria or virus that can spread to the central nervous system And with this one, they're going to diagnose you by taking a sample of that cerebrospinal fluid and sort of looking to see if there's anything in there that's not supposed to, like these microbes. Okay, so if you look at this picture, and you can kind of tell from this one too, there's not a lot of extra space in here, right? So any sort of inflammation or any sort of swelling, anything like that is going to start to sort of damage and kind of obstruct things from performing their proper functions. Okay, but you can see my little layers here, and again, this is why it's really, really important to sort of know where that cerebrospinal fluid is, because then if it comes up on your exams, you kind of go, okay, this is that area, or this is that space where that cerebrospinal fluid is going to be in, and this is where those bacteria and those viruses are going to kind of start to create a lot of problems. Okay, so here's another picture of the meningitis, and this is what your cerebrospinal fluid would look like if it had those, bacteria in there. Okay, but again, I can kind of look at all my layers, and I can kind of remember from the picture that, okay, it's going to be that cerebrospinal fluid that's going to start to get infected, and then again, things can start to spread to all the different parts of my nervous system and kind of shut down all the different systems in my body. One of the tests that they kind of do for this is where they have someone, kind of forcefully kind of flex your neck or try to bring your chin down to your chest, and what you're going to do is it's going to cause you a lot of discomfort, because when I forcefully bring my chin to my chest, I'm going to increase the pressure in my spinal column, and again, your spinal column is going to be surrounded by all this cerebrospinal fluid, and that increase in that pressure is going to cause you a lot of pain and discomfort. So it's one of those things where, if it's going around your high school or your college or anything like that, and you sort of feel, you get that really severe headache, you get that severe neck pain, it's always good to kind of be safe and make sure that this is not kind of happening. So here is the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's the fluid in and around the brain and the spinal cord. It's going to form this liquid cushion, okay, giving buoyancy to this central nervous system. This is a really cool thing here too, okay? So by floating the brain in the cerebrospinal fluid, we're going to reduce the brain's weight by 97%. And I know my kids over the weekend, they were kind of swimming in the pool, and they always like to kind of, see if they can pick you up with one hand when you're floating in the water. But this is kind of the same thing, right? When we float someone or something in a liquid, it's going to get a lot more buoyant. It's going to be a lot less light, okay? So it's preventing the delicate brain from being crushed under its own weight. So this is another really, really cool thing, and part of the reason why your brain just doesn't get crushed inside your skull. Protects brain and spinal cord from blows and trauma. Produced by the choroid plexus. This is always a really good multiple choice question too, is what produces the cerebrospinal fluid? So choroid plexus, and then it's going to circulate freely through these ventricles. Okay? And these are the ventricles kind of within your brain. And again, my cerebrospinal fluid is going to circulate through here, and then we can look at another picture, which is this one, and I can see where it's being produced in the middle here, and then I can kind of follow the pathway. Okay, I'm not going to ask you any questions about the pathway or anything like that. Just know that choroid plexus is going to be what makes the cerebrospinal fluid, and then know that it's kind of circulating through these little ventricles that are in that interior part of the brain. Okay, so now we get to the blood-brain barrier. So to function properly, the brain must maintain a constant internal environment. It's basically going to use this highly selective permeable barrier, and we saw this with just the cell membrane, and we said, hey, it's selectively permeable. Well, the blood-brain barrier, or the barrier for the brain, is going to be even more selective as to what it kind of allows in and out. So it separates the circulating blood from the brain's extracellular fluid, okay? And then it's going to be the protective mechanism that helps maintain this stable environment, okay? So we're going to have one more level of protection, making sure that nothing in the blood is going to be able to get into that cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so I have these brain endothelial cells. They're going to be connected with these tight junctions. They're going to be basically impermeable. Blood-borne substances must pass through 3 capillary layers, and we talked about this with like epithelial, and we talked about, we make these different layers and how it kind of filters things. This is the same kind of thing, okay? So we have these 3 capillary layers that they have to pass through before reaching the neurons. They're going to be really selective, so they're going to allow nutrients, they're going to allow waste to pass, but they're going to block bacteria, ineffective against certain things, so fats, oxygen, carbon dioxide. And this is kind of why drugs and alcohol act so quickly on our bodies, is that they're going to be absorbed really, really quickly, and they're not going to sort of be disrupted by this barrier. And then the other important thing is that injury, okay, so any sort of trauma can also disrupt this barrier, and then again, things that are not supposed to be allowed into the cerebrospinal fluid will be able to sort of pass through. Okay, so now we're on to the next one here, and this is just a little picture of those 3 layers, right? So these are my capillaries, and I can see where everything's got to filter through a bunch of things before it can get to that cerebrospinal fluid. So again, just another layer of protection. How I'm going to try to keep everything separate from that central nervous system, because again, if anything bad happens in the central nervous system, my body is unable to sort of keep up all the functions of the rest of the body. So now we get to the part for the lab and the main things that I have to kind of memorize, and I have to really, again, make sure you can label them. And then again, I want to know just what the basic function of all these structures are going to be. So I have my cerebrum, I have my cerebellum, I have this diencephalon, which is going to have a few parts to it, and then I have this brainstem, okay? And then we get a bunch of different little terminology, and these are the cerebral hemisphere terminology. So I get a gyrus, which are going to be these elevated ridges. Most of you have kind of seen pictures of the brain, and you see that it has these little elevated ridges, so the proper term for that is gyrus. You're going to have sulci, which are going to be shallow grooves. I'm going to have fissures, and those are going to be deeper grooves, and these are the ones that are going to separate the regions of the brain for me. And then I'm also going to have that cortex, or that outer layer of nervous tissue that you see kind of anytime you see pictures of the brain. Okay, so here's a picture where I can kind of find all those things. I can find the outer tissue, I can see the little bumps, I can see the little, fissures, and I can see, some are deeper than others. I can do the same thing from the side, and again, this is very similar to the skull, so it shouldn't be anything that we're really adding on, right? So it's still frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. So again, we're just adding a few things in here, and a lot of the terms and the labeling will be pretty similar to what you guys kind of learned in the skull chapter, okay? All right, and then here's a picture where it just shows you at the bottom where I get that gyrus, right? I get that fissure, or the deeper sulcus. I get a smaller sulcus, and I can just kind of see all the different terms that we were sort of just mentioning, okay? And now we're going to go over kind of each part of the brain, and we're going to look at kind of what the main functions of each little parts of the brain are going to be. Okay, and this is a cool thing where, people say like, well, how do we know what part of the brain does what? Well, they can monitor the activity, right? So they can monitor sort of what parts of the brain are active as they kind of stimulate you with different materials. So if you're looking at something, you're hearing something, you're speaking, you're thinking, different parts of your brain are going to kind of light up, because again, this is just electrical activity that's going on. So it's one of those things that they can kind of monitor and see which parts of the brain are working when you're doing different tests. Okay, and this is a really cool, there's actually like a book that you can read, and there's like this autobiography, sort of like a documentary, which is this Free Solo, okay, and this is Alex Honnold, and he's a mountain climber. But the thing that he does that's really cool is that he climbs these crazy mountains with no ropes, right? So he's not attached to the wall at all, where if he slips or falls or anything happens, he's basically just going to fall to his death, okay? But it talks about basically just controlling your emotions and doing these, simple things, but where the risk factors are so high. But it's really, really interesting because they do a whole little thing on his brain, and they do all this testing on him to kind of see why he can do these things that most people would never want to do. Okay, and this is kind of what he's climbing with no ropes, right? This El Capitan, which is 3,000 feet high, right? And the cool part about the documentary is that the people that are the most scared are actually the people that are kind of filming, and it's actually like his friends that are filming it and climbing, and they have drones and helicopters, and the guy that's kind of making the film is the one that's the most afraid of, kind of making him or contributing to him kind of falling and kind of dying. So it's interesting to see the person that's actually doing the climbing is sometimes not as scared as all the people that are kind of around him. Right? But this is one of the cool things. So we have this amygdala, and it's this almond-shaped set of neurons located deep in the brain's medial temporal lobe, okay? And its basically main job is this fear perception, okay? And what they find with him, when they kind of stimulate and they do all this testing on him, is that his amygdala doesn't really get activated as much as other people kind of would under the same circumstances. So it's one of those where you have to kind of wonder, was he always kind of like that, or has he learned to kind of be like that through his experiences? Hard to say, but we all kind of have those friends, even when we're kids, that are just a little more afraid of things and a little more afraid to try things. You'll find this when you have your own children too. And then you always have the other friend that just is never afraid to try anything or still doing crazy stuff, when they have like a broken arm or something like that. Okay, but just a really interesting thing to kind of watch and sort of look at, that kind of just complements everything that we're going to talk about in the nervous system chapter. Okay, and we've all kind of experienced this on our own, right? So I know my kids took gymnastics, and this is with everybody. If I just take a 2x4, I take this little balance beam and I put it on the floor, almost everybody's going to be able to kind of walk across it, and really we're not even going to kind of think about it. But if we raise it up, right, and my daughter did gymnastics for a little bit of time, all of a sudden it becomes much scary. And even this thing that's maybe just 3 or 4 feet off the ground, it becomes much, much scarier for people just to kind of walk across. And a lot of people are going to kind of fall off of this because they get really afraid and they sort of lose that fluidity of their movement as they get a little more afraid, a little more tense. Okay, so it's just one of those interesting things that we've kind of realized, but maybe we just never kind of put any terms or names to it. So now we get to the brain lobes and regions. And again, I want to make sure I can label them, and I want to make sure I have just a basic understanding of what the functions of all of these are. And you're also going to have these special little areas. Anything that's got a special area that has a special function is, again, a good thing for all your multiple choice stuff. Okay, so this is, again, the lobes are the same as with the skull. So we have our frontal lobe here, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. You can see I get this motor cortex, I get this Broca's area. You want to know which special parts are in each lobe, and then again, I just want to have a general understanding of sort of what the functions of all these lobes are, and you just kind of have to kind of memorize them. Okay, so frontal lobe, storage motor patterns, concentration, elaborate thought, judgment, inhibition, personality, and a lot of times you'll find that lobes are going to have similar sort of jobs in common. So a lot of the things you're gonna be able to kind of group them together and make them a little bit easier to sort of remember. Broca's area, okay, located, again, important to remember that it's in the frontal lobe. This is going to be my language production, and then I also get this motor cortex in the frontal lobe, and this is going to be my voluntary motor activity. What you're really looking for is when, especially, if with me, where you're a chiropractor, you're a doctor, physical therapist, you'll find people that have sort of deficiencies in some of these tests or in some of these things that are kind of going on in their life. And sometimes it can lead you to sort of think about, okay, maybe they have some sort of tumor or something going on in the brain where they're just not functioning properly. So it's important to kind of remember that a lot of your symptoms are going to lead you to investigate different parts of the brain. Okay, so temporal lobe, this is an easy one because it's kind of right by your ears. So this one was always kind of an easier one to remember, but it's auditory reception, expressed behavior, receptive speech, memory retrieval, information retrieval, and I get another area, which is this Wernicke's area, and again, it's going to be language comprehension. Okay, so that's my temporal lobe on the side. We go to the parietal lobe, so processing sensory input, sensory discrimination, body orientation, primary somatic area, secondary somatic area, so a lot of body stuff in here, right? And we want to start to kind of remember, like, okay, what was soma in all my other chapters? Soma is going to be that body, and again, this is going to be that primary area for all this input kind of coming in. Okay, so parietal lobe. Now I get my occipital lobe. This one always kind of messes people up because my eyes are at the front, right? But your occipital lobe is going to be the one for visual reception area and visual interpretation, and it's going to be at the back part here of that brain. Okay, so now we get to the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the brainstem, and this is going to be this part kind of coming down here, is going to be breathing, digestion, heart control, blood vessels. A lot of my autonomic stuff is going to kind of come with that brainstem. Okay, cerebellum is my bottom part over here. Coordination and control of voluntary movement, and I always got, you got the C with cerebellum, and then I got the coordination and I got the control of that voluntary movement. So a lot of movement stuff is going to come from that cerebellum. Okay, and this is another cool photo where you're talking about, coordinating information. Remember, we're going to actually combine all this information and kind of send it up to the brain, and then my brain is going to interpret all of it and kind of decide what the best thing to do is. So it's not just one thing at a time, and we get these different fibers. So we get this association fibers, which allows me to sort of coordinate info within the same hemisphere. And then I also get these commissural fibers, and those are going to be the ones that are going to allow me to sort of coordinate info from all these different parts from other kind of hemispheres. So just a cool thing to remember that it's not just one thing going at a time. I'm going to, take my vision, I'm going to take my hearing, I'm going to take all this proprioceptive stuff from all my receptors, I'm going to combine it all so that I can give my brain as much information as possible so that it can make the best decisions. So now we get to the cerebellum, okay, and we talked about this a little bit, but it's going to adjust my motor output to ensure coordination and balance. So it's mostly this coordination and balance, receiving information from my proprioceptors. We're going to talk about those when we get into the peripheral nervous system. But again, I have all these different receptors that send different info to my brain. evaluates body position and momentum. It's going to calculate the best way to coordinate force, direction, muscular contraction, prevents overshooting. So if I'm reaching for a glass, I'm reaching to grab something, I'm going to actually, it's amazing how good we are at just kind of reaching and grabbing things without even thinking about it. So aids posture, creates a blueprint for coordinated movement. Okay, so cerebellum, again, it's going to be mostly this movement stuff that it's going to play a big role in. And here's a picture of that cerebellum. So again, I wouldn't really ask you, just the basic things of the cerebellum. And mostly, again, don't get too caught up, kind of like the skull, don't get too caught up in the brain. I am going to ask you the main parts of the brain, and obviously you're going to have some of those functions, but just focus on the main things, because those are the most of the things that I'm going to kind of ask you. Okay, so make sure you can identify the cerebellum, make sure you can do all the lobes. A lot of times people get caught up in the little things, and they forget that they're going to have to do some of the easier things too. Okay, and then here's a real picture. And again, this is a good one because I can give you the cerebellum, right? But I can give you the pons, I can give you the medulla oblongata. It's a good picture for all these other things. And this is one it's actually from an actual cadaver or a brain. So now we get to this diencephalon, okay? And these are the things that it's going to include. And again, we want to just make sure that we can label them, and we want to know just the basic function of each of these structures, okay? So the diencephalon is going to be your thalamus, and it's mostly going to be that middle part of the brain, okay? So hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and we're going to have this pineal gland, okay? So it's basically this whole middle part here, and you can kind of follow these: thalamus, right? Hypothalamus, and then I get one gland on the back part, and I get one gland on the front. The front one is the pituitary gland, the back one is the pineal gland. So again, good photo, because I can ask you a bunch of questions on here, and I can ask you other stuff as we get down into kind of like the brainstem a little bit too. Okay, so important one just to be able to find all those structures that we just kind of listed. Okay, and here's a real picture. The only thing that's not in here is going to be that pituitary gland. It's kind of hard to find. Okay, but same thing, you just want to be able to find all the different regions and make sure you can label them. This is all your practice photos and things like that. And then again, be able to kind of tie in, once you have them kind of memorized and labeled, make sure you can tie in what the general function of each of these is going to be. So your thalamus is going to be the relay station for information coming into the brain. And it kind of makes sense because it's kind of right in the middle, right? So everything's going to come up this is going to lead to your spinal cord, right? So everything is coming up here, it's going to hit this middle part, and then it's going to get sent to all the different parts of your brain so that it can be analyzed properly. So it sorts and edits information, okay? So info that helps regulate emotions, visceral functions, instructions that help direct motor activity, inputs for memory and sensation. But the main thing you want to remember is that it's going to sort and edit and act as this relay station for all this info that's kind of coming into the brain. Hypothalamus is going to be a little bit more below, so located below the thalamus, and this is going to be all my autonomic stuff, okay? So autonomic nervous system, physical responses to emotions, temperature, food intake, water balance, thirst, sleeping, endocrine functions. Again, a lot of autonomic stuff is going to be this hypothalamus, okay? Pituitary gland, we're going to look at this one a little bit more when we get to the endocrine chapter. But we want to remember all our glands are going to produce these hormones, okay? So this one is important for controlling growth and development. Produces hormones that control the functioning of the endocrine glands. So I get two, right? I have the anterior pituitary and I have the posterior pituitary. And again, important because different symptoms and different malfunctions in the body are going to kind of tell me which one is being affected. But anterior pituitary does my growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, my puberty stuff, my adrenals. Posterior pituitary is going to really be just this anti-diuretic hormone, okay? But really, really important one, again, when it comes to different little diseases in the body or tumors or growths or things like that. A lot of times the pituitary gland will be one of those ones that's affected. So pineal gland is going to secrete the hormone melatonin. So melatonin, most of us has heard of for sleep-inducing hormone. A lot of people kind of take melatonin. There's two kinds of people that kind of have trouble sleeping. So there's the people that kind of have trouble falling asleep, okay? And then there's the people that fall asleep, but then they kind of wake up. The people that just have trouble falling asleep, that's the one that melatonin is going to be the most helpful for. The people that fall asleep and then wake up and then have trouble going back to sleep, that's a much harder thing to kind of fix. And what they'll try to do is like a time-released melatonin, but it never really seems to kind of do the trick. But it's basically, again, pineal gland is going to make my melatonin for me, and then again, it's going to be involved in my sleep. And then again, we come back to this picture. And again, I just want to be able to find and sort of have this one beside me when I'm going through the chapter so that I can quickly look at the structures. And again, I want to know how to label them, and I want to know just what the basic function of each one of these is going to kind of be. Okay, now we get to the brainstem. So we have this medulla oblongata, we get the pons, and we get the midbrain. Okay, so here's a picture of the actual bottom of your brain. And for the peripheral nervous system, we can start to see all these little cranial nerves here, right? But we want to find that midbrain. The pons is really, really prominent, so that's usually the one people find, and then they kind of build off of that, and then the medulla oblongata is going to be the one below. And you want to kind of remember the pathway, right? What is it going to pass through first before it kind of gets up into that thalamus? Okay, and here's another little picture from the side, another good one. Medulla oblongata, the pons, and then I can see this little midbrain kind of right back in this area up in here, and then there again is my thalamus. I can find the hypothalamus. I could do all those different little structures too. Okay, so label them, and then we'll go over the functions. So midbrain coordinates head and eye movements. It's going to be the relay for hearing receptors. It's also going to be this startle reflex, okay, or reflex responding to sound. So if you hear a really, really loud noise, you're always going to kind of tear. Like if you're in a restaurant and someone drops a tray or a glass or a thing, everyone's going to kind of turn instantly to kind of see what's going on. That's going to be your startle reflex. The pons is going to chiefly be a conducting bridge or tract. So it's a pathway between higher brain centers and the spinal cord. And again, I'm just relaying info between all these little brain areas. The medulla oblongata is usually the only part that everyone has kind of heard of. And it's kind of from this movie, The Water Boy, where he gets into this big argument about what the function of the kind of medulla oblongata is and why our, I think it's alligators are so sort of cranky. But this is the one where, the reason that most people sort of have heard of this medulla oblongata. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, it's a good movie to watch. So here are the real functions of the medulla oblongata. So it's, again, cardiovascular stuff, respiratory stuff, okay, so adjust the force and rate of heart contraction in response to body needs. So it's going to come into play, we looked at all the energy systems and sort of how my intensity of activity is. So this is where the medulla oblongata is going to come into play. It's going to be my vasomotor center. That's going to kind of change the blood vessel diameter. So if I need a lot of blood flow, I'm going to dilate my blood vessels. If I want to kind of close down the blood flow to that area and move it somewhere else, I can constrict them. Respiratory center controls the rate and depth of breathing. Again, going to go with how much energy I need and how much oxygen do I need to kind of take in to kind of run all my systems and get all that oxygen to all the different parts of the body. And then various other centers, so it's going to be vomiting, hiccups, swallowing, coughing, sneezing is going to be part of this medulla oblongata. Okay, and this is a picture just to kind of remind you why all these things are important. But, you can see in this one where we have some tumors kind of growing. And what's going to happen with this person is obviously, a lot of times they're not going to have all these tumors at the same time. But you can see where this is just a closed-in space, right? And there's not a lot of extra room in there. So anything that grows or gets inflamed or is not supposed to be there is going to start to affect these different little tissues. And a lot of times the very first thing you're going to find is symptoms based on where these things are kind of located. Okay, so by knowing all the things that we just kind of talked about and knowing what the functions and the parts of the brain are, sometimes these little symptoms are going to kind of show up, and that's going to lead us to sort of investigate things. And the key to surviving and sort of doing well with tumors and cancer is finding things early before they start to sort of move around and go to all these different little parts. Okay, so it can be one of those things where sometimes you'll just kind of notice that things are not functioning properly, but that can lead you to getting someone to kind of go find help or go to their doctor or their specialist to kind of see if there's anything more serious kind of going on. Okay, and here's a little picture of a brain scan where I can see that there's a big mass in here. And again, they can do some really, really cool imaging. But again, a lot of times the symptoms, people are going to kind of realize that, hey, this has been going on for a long time before anything, even in the imaging, kind of shows up. A lot of times these symptoms have been showing up for quite a long time. Okay, and that's the end of part one. Again, in part two, we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at the spinal cord.